Welcome to Inside East African Politics. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's, well, definitely been noticed. The media engagement of Ethiopia's Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. There are quite different takes on his approach, and we've gathered a range of perspectives to explore it.
Right. We've looked through reports from major international news outlets, observations from press freedom groups, and also historical accounts to really get a handle on how Abiy interacts with the media landscape.
And our goal today is basically to unpack that interaction. We'll look at how he engages, explore the claims that maybe he's avoiding scrutiny, and importantly, put his approach into historical context with past Ethiopian leaders. So you can walk away with a hopefully clear, well-rounded picture pretty quickly.
Okay, so starting with Abiy Ahmed's interactions with the international media, one thing becomes clear almost immediately. Direct sort of one-on-one engagement with big foreign news outlets, CNN, BBC, NPR. It's been pretty limited.
Limited feels like,
yeah,
almost like an understatement based on some accounts. Outside of very structured things like speeches at the UN or the World Economic Forum, those more candid interview opportunities just don't seem to happen much. And there are specific examples that really stand out.
Absolutely. Like take his Nobel Peace Prize back in October 2019. The Nobel officials themselves noted he told them he wouldn't do the usual press conference or take questions in Oslo.
Really?
Yeah, and they actually called his refusal highly problematic. Which, I mean, that's strong language coming from the Nobel Committee.
Highly problematic. Wow. And wasn't it the BBC that also observed something similar? That he kind of shuns interviews with reporters, even though he seems okay with the public spotlight in other ways.
That's right, they did note that. And looking back, there were really only a couple of significant international appearances on record where he took questions. Well, there was a press conference at the Élysée Palace in Paris. That was October 2018. And then in January 2019, he was on a panel at Davos, moderated by Fareed Zakaria from CNN. That had a brief one-on-one bit, too.
Okay, so beyond those two moments, quite early on, his international communication relies more on, what, prepared stuff?
Pretty much. It seems to lean heavily on prepared statements and these big set-piece speeches. He'll address the UN General Assembly, yes, or AU summits, but then he doesn't hold those open press Q&As afterwards. It's very much about controlled messaging delivered on his terms.
Right, a clear pattern then of maybe sidestepping that unscripted back and forth internationally. Does that carry over to how he deals with the media inside Ethiopia?
It really does. You see that same scarcity of direct interaction mirrored domestically.
Yeah.
Formal press conferences are few and far between.
So for the Ethiopian public, his messages tend to come through state media or maybe his own social media. You're not really seeing him sit down for like independent talk shows or anything like that.
Exactly. Those kinds of appearances are basically non-existent. Although there were a couple of notable moments, especially early in his term, that hinted at maybe something different.
Oh.
Yeah, back in August 2018, he held his first press conference since taking office. And what was really striking was that journalists from state outlets and formerly banned private media were actually there together, side by side. Groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists pointed that out as a really positive sign.
I remember that detail now. State media next to journalists from places like Oromia Media Network, which had been banned. That must have felt like a big shift.
It really did signal that initial hope for openness. And he did hold another public briefing in Addis Ababa in March 2019. But, since those early days, the pattern has definitely shifted again.
Shifted back towards
Mostly official broadcasts and unilateral statements. State TV and radio carry his speeches regularly. Like, remember late 2021, that video of Abiy in military gear speaking for the Tigray Front, that aired on the state-aligned Fana network.
Right. And what about independent journalists in Ethiopia? How do they feel about getting access?
Well, the reports suggest they feel largely shut out from direct access to him. I recall an Ethiopian reporter mentioning back in 2019 that, the media felt freer overall than before, but actually getting access to Abiy's government specifically, still a huge hurdle.
So if we're summing up his domestic approach, it sounds like he generally steers clear of unscripted situations. Policy news might break on his Facebook page first, like that message about the final drive in late 2021, which later got flagged.
Right, flagged for incitement.
And any interviews seem to happen almost exclusively in these very formal, controlled settings.
That's the picture, yes. And that leads us straight into the big question people ask, is Abiy deliberately avoiding the press? Maybe out of concern about tough questions. And, opinions are definitely divided on that.
Okay, let's get into that debate. What's the view from critics, the international observers who see this pattern?
Well, the critical take is basically that his media shyness suggests he's uncomfortable with scrutiny. The Guardian did a timeline piece that noted he has rarely given interviews since taking office, which lines up with what we've been discussing.
And we already mentioned the Nobel Committee calling his refusal to take questions highly problematic. That fits this view, too.
It absolutely does. And the BBC saying he shuns interviews with reporters. Observers holding this view point out that even for something like the Nobel Prize visit, he skipped the standard news conference. They see that pattern as pretty clear evidence he's wary of facing tough, unprepared questions.
So for those critics, it looks like a strategy to avoid being put on the spot. What's the other side? How do his supporters or his government frame this?
They push back strongly on the avoidance narrative. They argue that actually he's overseen a more open media environment in Ethiopia overall than his predecessors.
How do they back that up? What's the evidence there?
They point to concrete things like licensing over 40 new broadcasters. And, maybe crucially, the fact that those frequent internet blackouts, which were a major censorship tool before him, largely stopped under his administration.
That's a fair point about the broader media climate, separate from his personal interactions.
Exactly. And his press secretary, Bilin Sayum, has actually defended him on this, saying he's one of the most accessible Ethiopian prime ministers to date in public and media engagements.
Accessible in public engagements, maybe, but the media part is what's debated.
Right. The argument from this side could also be about personal style. Maybe he prefers less adversarial settings. You know, unlike his predecessor, Hailemariam, who once publicly said he was ready to be criticized by any journalists. Maybe Abiy just prefers speeches and social media.
So this view suggests it might not be fear, but rather a choice of communication style, or maybe just the sheer pressure of his job, making those controlled channels more practical than outright evasion.
That sums up the counterargument well. It reframes it as a choice of how and where he communicates, not necessarily why in terms of fear.
Okay, but we really need to put this in context. How does Abiy's approach actually stack up against recent Ethiopian history? What about leaders like Zenawi or Hailemariam Desalegn?
Yeah, context is absolutely crucial here. And the baseline is that Ethiopian prime ministers haven't generally been big on welcoming lots of media scrutiny. It's historically been a pretty tightly managed affair.
Okay, tell us about Zenawi. He was in power quite a while, 1995 to 2012.
Meles was known for being, well, quite reclusive with the press. An Ethiopian journalist, Desalegn recalled that basically no private press journalist privately interviewed him. You might get into a formal press conference, sure, but that one-on-one, off-the-cuff stuff, it just didn't happen. Meles really kept interactions to those very controlled settings.
And Hailemariam Desalegn, who followed him from 2012 to 2018, was he similar?
Largely, yes. He continued a pretty guarded approach. Now, he did grant a few interviews here and there. I think there was one with BBC World Service in 2015 where he actually claimed he welcomed criticism.
Oh, interesting, given the general pattern.
But those were definitely the exceptions, not the rule.
So compared to Meles and Hailemariam, Abiy did seem, at least initially, a bit more open.
For a brief period, yes. You had those banned outlets coming back. He held those couple of press conferences, like that August 2018 one, with the mix of journalists that felt different. And of course, state media covers his public speeches extensively, which is similar to the past.
But in terms of his personal media time, how does it compare day to day?
Well, in practical terms, his personal media exposure is still quite low, very much in line with Meles and Hailemariam, actually. He's given far fewer press conferences, far fewer direct interviews than you might expect in a system moving towards more openness.
Even internationally? Hailemariam spoke to the BBC, you said.
Right. Hailemariam did engage with some international outlets like the BBC. Abiy hasn't really granted those kinds of extensive one-on-one interviews internationally since those very early days.
So the takeaway from the history lesson is that while the media environment saw some changes under Abiy, his own personal accessibility, especially for unscripted stuff, hasn't dramatically broken from that historical pattern of tightly controlled communication.
That seems to be the core finding, yes.
Yeah.
Despite those initial changes, when you look at direct, personal, unscripted engagement, it remains pretty low, historically speaking.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then. What are the main things you, listening, should take away from our deep dive today?
Well, I think it's clear the picture is kind of multifaceted. You have international observers, rights groups, who consistently point out that Abiy's personal media interaction is unusually limited for a head of government. And he's definitely faced direct criticism for it from the Nobel Committee, from journalists, about avoiding spontaneous questions.
But then there's the other side of the coin.
Exactly. His government highlights the significant steps taken to open up the media space in Ethiopia. New licenses, fewer internet blackouts, and they frame this as his positive contribution to media freedom. So the debate isn't so much about whether he's putting new restrictions on others, but more about his personal choice to communicate mainly through controlled channels.
And why should you care about all this? Why does it matter?
Because this isn't just about one leader's preferences. I mean, how any leader chooses to communicate. Do they prefer prepared statements? Do they use social media directly? Do they regularly face journalists asking unscripted questions? That tells you a lot. It speaks volumes about the relationship with public accountability, with transparency, and really about how information itself flows in a country. It shapes how people see their own government and how the rest of the world understands what's going on. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. When you consider that historical context, how Ethiopian leaders have typically dealt with the media, and then you look at the specific ways Abiy communicates, both what he does and what he doesn't do, what does that whole pattern suggest to you about the challenges and maybe the priorities of political leadership in that environment?